It started with a whisper behind closed doors. In mid-2025, China's top diplomat quietly told European leaders something Beijing had never admitted before. If Russia falls, China is next. The US would then shift its whole focus to Beijing. That single confession shattered the illusion of strength the Communist Party had worked decades to build. It exposed something terrifying, that China's leaders no longer believe they can survive a full Western pivot against them. But this wasn't just one moment of fear, it was the beginning of a cascade. Because as the cracks in China's confidence spread, so did the collapse. A real estate market vaporizing trillions, a population imploding faster than projections, a private sector suffocating under communism with Chinese characteristics, and a regime now so obsessed with control, it's strangling the very growth it needs to survive. China's collapse didn't begin on the battlefield or the stock market, it began with a secret, and now that secret can't be contained. But here's what Beijing doesn't want you to know. The collapse started months before that confession. It started in the grocery stores, the factories, the bank accounts of ordinary Chinese citizens. By late 2025, something deeply wrong was happening to China's economy. Prices were falling, not just slowing down, falling. For more than 3 years, wholesale prices had been in negative territory. Consumer prices were barely moving, sometimes dropping month after month. In any normal economy, prices rise. Inflation might be annoying, but it's a sign people are spending, businesses are hiring, and money is moving. But China was trapped in deflation. And deflation is an economic horror show, because when prices fall, consumers stop spending. Why buy today when it will be cheaper tomorrow? So they wait and wait. Businesses see sales collapse, they cut prices to move inventory. That makes deflation worse. Then they lay off workers. Those workers stop spending, prices fall further. It's a death spiral. Chinese economists started using a new term, balance sheet recession. Households and companies so buried in debt, so terrified of the future, that they refuse to spend no matter how cheap things get. They're not being cautious, they're paralyzed. The Chinese government tried everything. Cut interest rates, pumped money into banks, announced stimulus packages. Nothing worked. Because the old playbook, the one that turned China into an economic superpower, is dead. For decades, Beijing's formula was simple. Build. Build roads, build cities, build factories, borrow whatever it takes, growth will pay for itself. Except it didn't. Every yuan of investment now returns less and less. High-speed rail lines run empty. Apartment towers sit vacant. Factory churns out products nobody wants. One advisor to the Chinese government admitted what everyone was thinking. Fundamental reforms are needed deep within the microstructures of the economy. Translation: the entire model is broken. But deflation is just a symptom. The disease goes much deeper. China has a new word for what's killing the economy: involution. It sounds academic. It's not. Involution is when an entire system starts cannibalizing itself. When companies, sectors, entire industries get locked in a race to the bottom, pouring in resources, slashing prices, destroying each other for shrinking scraps. It's economic self-destruction, and it's everywhere. Take solar panels. For years, China dominated the global solar industry. Panels were supposed to be the future. Clean energy, high-tech manufacturing, a symbol of China's innovation. In 2025, China was able to produce twice as many solar panels as the entire world could use that year. Twice. Factories kept building capacity anyway. Local governments wanted jobs. State banks kept lending. Nobody wanted to be the one to stop, so panels flooded the market. Prices collapsed. Profit margins evaporated. China's top solar manufacturers, companies that employed hundreds of thousands, collectively lost $40 billion in 2024 alone. 40 billion gone. Then came the layoffs. The biggest solar companies shed nearly a third of their workforce just to stay alive. Entire factory towns built around panel production watched their economies collapse. Workers who'd moved across provinces for these jobs found themselves stranded with nothing. This was supposed to be a flagship industry. Instead, it became a bloodbath. And solar is just one example. Steel, cement, electric vehicles, batteries, even advanced semiconductors, all suffering from the same disease. Too much capacity, too few buyers. Companies kept alive only by government life support. These aren't just struggling businesses, they're zombie companies. dead in profitability but kept shambling forward by endless debt from state banks. And here's the really twisted part. Those state banks are using your money. China's household savings, the nest egg of hundreds of millions of families, get funneled into these walking corpses. For years, Beijing denied there was a problem. Admitting overcapacity would mean admitting their industrial policy had failed. It would invite trade retaliation from countries sick of being dumped on. So they buried it, until they couldn't anymore. In July 2025, President Xi Jinping called an emergency meeting. The topic? Ending disorderly low-price competition and eliminating excess capacity in key sectors. Weeks later, the Ministry of Industry summoned solar industry leaders to Beijing. The message was blunt: the price war must end. Underperforming producers need to exit the market. It was a public admission of failure. But here's the trap Beijing faces. They can't actually let these companies die. Shutting down factories means mass unemployment, angry workers, social instability, so they're stuck. Keep the zombies alive and watch the economy rot, or pull the plug and risk chaos. Either way, China loses. But if you think overcapacity is China's biggest problem, you haven't seen what's happening to the housing market. For over 20 years, real estate was the engine of everything. Local governments sold land to developers for cash, developers built towers, families bought apartments, often multiple units as investments, banks feasted on mortgages. At its peak, real estate accounted for nearly 30% of China's entire economy. The mantra was simple: home prices only go up. The government will never let them fall. Then they fell. What started as a slow deflation in 2023 turned into a free fall by 2024. Giant developers began defaulting one after another. Evergrande, Country Garden, Sunac, Greenland, Kaiser, Shimo, Logan, Sifi, names that once symbolized China's urban boom were now synonymous with financial carnage. And the debt reconstructions? Brutal. Creditors, the people and institutions who lent these companies money, were being forced to accept haircuts of 50, 70, even 80% or more. Translation: if you were owed 100 million, you'd be lucky to get back 20 million, maybe 10, maybe less. In early 2025, Sunac China pushed through a restructuring of 15.4 billion yuan in bonds. Creditors had to accept more than half of that simply vanishing. Then, Logan Group proposed eliminating 3/4 of its bond debt. Sifi Holdings went even further, wiping out over 80%. But the real horror is in the details. Some creditors were offered compensation in kind. Instead of cash, they'd get unsold apartments, or stakes in half-vacant hotels, or plots of barren land. One bondholder described it as receiving a fancy-looking envelope with nothing inside, because when they tried to sell these assets, they discovered the truth: they were worth almost nothing. Here's the most shocking example. In 2023, Sifi pledged its stake in a massive residential project in Chongqing, a collateral for bondholders. The company valued it at 700 million yuan. That seems safe, a concrete asset backing the debt. By early 2025, Sifi sold that entire project to raise cash. After paying off bank loans and other obligations, bondholders received 2.25 million yuan, from 700 million to 2.25 million. That's 0.3% recovery, a total wipeout. And it's not an isolated cause. Another developer, RNF, had pledged a hotel in Guangzhou to back a bond. When default came, creditors discovered a bank that had a prior mortgage and seized the property. Bondholders got nothing. Some experts now say many of China's restructuring deals are worse than outright bankruptcy. At least in bankruptcy, there are legal rules about asset distribution. In China's murky restructurings, developers make rosy promises, overvalue assets, and leave creditors in the dark about what they'll actually recover. Trust has evaporated. Foreign investors who bought Chinese property bonds are now warning others: stay away. Domestic creditors are furious. Some have organized protests demanding Beijing forces developers to pay what they owe. The government ignores them. As of late 2025, over 100 major developers have defaulted on some portion of that debt. More than 1.6 trillion yuan in property sector bonds are in default or distress. And here's the ticking time bomb. An estimated 526 billion yuan in developer debt comes due in 2025 alone. That's even higher than the amount that matured in 2024, which the industry couldn't handle. Who's going to pay it? Nobody. These companies can't pay what they owe. Not now, not ever. The Chinese government is scrambling. Regulators have dispatched teams to big developers to oversee risk mitigation. Banks are being told to extend loans, avoid calling in debts. Local governments have quietly taken over some stalled projects to deliver homes to angry buyers. They're trying to prevent a full credit system meltdown. And China's advantage is control. Unlike America in 2008, where Lehman Brothers were allowed to fail spectacularly, China can order banks to hide losses, courts to delay bankruptcies, state firms to absorb damage. So we're watching a slow-motion car crash instead of a sudden explosion. But the outcome is the same. Years of property excess are ending in a long, painful unwind. Land sale revenues have collapsed, starving local government budgets. Mortgage lending has dried up. Construction has plummeted, killing jobs for millions of migrant workers. The ripple effects are everywhere. China's growth is sagging under the weight of a real estate sector that went from an unstoppable boom to a bottomless bust. So China's economy is in freefall, but that's only half the story, because there's something that makes all of this much worse. Remember that whisper behind closed doors? In mid-2025, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi sat across from European officials in Brussels and said something Beijing had never admitted publicly. China does not want to see Russia lose in Ukraine, not out of loyalty, out of fear. Wang warned that if Russia falls, the United States would be free to turn its strategic focus towards China. For years, Chinese public stance on Ukraine had been studied neutrality. We're not a party to the conflict. Now, behind closed doors, that facade crumbled. Beijing's greatest unspoken anxiety was laid bare. China could not afford to become America's sole geopolitical target. This confession sent shockwaves through diplomatic circles because it revealed something crucial. China's lenders no longer project confidence. They're terrified. And history shows what happens when great powers start admitting their fears. In 1944, as Nazi Germany's defeat loomed, Imperial Japan privately braced for an Allied onslaught, knowing that all military might would soon pivot to the Pacific. In the late Cold War, Soviet leaders understood they couldn't endure a united Western front. They sought arms treaties and proxy wars to ease the pressure. The British Empire, after World War II, conceded strategically vital colonies once it became clear it couldn't face all threats at once. Each time, the admission of weakness came first, the decline followed. Wang Yi's confession is China's version of that moment, and the calculation behind it is deeply cynical. Beijing prefers a protracted conflict in Ukraine, one that keeps Washington divided across two fronts, over a quick peace that frees America to focus on Asia, even if it means prolonged bloodshed in Europe. A frozen war suits China. It buys time for a military build-up and regional assertiveness, while NATO looks elsewhere. But by saying this out loud, China alerted the world to its mindset. The veil lifted. Beijing appears less like a confident rising power and more like an anxious giant terrified of encirclement. And right on cue, the world started slamming doors. In July 2025, President Donald Trump dropped a bombshell on social media. Any nation aligning with anti-American blocs like BRICS would face an automatic 10% tariff on all exports to the United States. No exceptions. The threat was clearly aimed at China and any country drifting into Beijing's orbit. At the July 2025 BRICS Summit in Rio de Janeiro, Brazilian President Lula da Silva fired back publicly. He called Trump's threat very mistaken and very irresponsible. Then came the most blistering line. "The world has changed. We don't want an emperor, we want sovereign countries." Lula also pushed for BRICS nations to reduce reliance on the US dollar in trade. Why, he asked, should every deal between Brazil and India or China and South Africa have to use dollars? China's official response tried to strike a cooperative tone. Foreign Ministry spokesperson Mao Ning emphasized that BRICS is about openness, inclusiveness, and win-win cooperation, not confrontation. On Trump's tariff threats, she warned that trade wars have no winners and protectionism leads nowhere. But here's what's revealing. Beijing had no direct retaliation. No counter tariffs, no threats of sanctions on American goods, just words. A decade ago, China might have answered fire with fire. Now, restraint. And that restraint speaks volumes, because China's economic vulnerabilities make a full-blown trade war exceedingly dangerous for Beijing. The United States remains one of China's largest export destinations, despite diversification efforts. America buys hundreds of billions of dollars of Chinese electronics, machinery, and goods every year. A 10% tariff or higher would price many of those products out the market. Factory closures in China, mass layoffs. For an economy already on the ropes, that scenario is catastrophic. Chinese leaders are walking a tightrope. They talk about diversifying trade partners, accelerating deals with Southeast Asia, the Middle East, Africa, Latin America, but none of these alternatives can replace the scale and purchasing power of Western markets, not in the near term. China's factories need Western buyers, and those buyers are increasingly wary. Beyond tariffs, a broader technological and financial decoupling is accelerating. The US has imposed sweeping export controls to cut off China's access to advanced semiconductors. Dozens of Chinese tech firms are blacklisted from buying critical components. American and European countries are being encouraged, even mandated, to reduce reliance on Chinese supply chains for strategic goods. Washington is even discussing restricting US capital from flowing to certain Chinese tech sectors. Each of these steps tightens the noose slightly. Individually, none is fatal. Collectively, they threaten to strangle China's future growth, and the timing couldn't be worse. Just as China's internal engines are sputtering, external pressures are mounting rapidly. After a post-pandemic export rebound, China's exports started sagging in 2023 and 2024. By 2025, export growth was no longer reliable. In some months, exports actually contracted. The combination of weaker global demand and rising trade barriers is sapping what was once a lifeline. And when exports slow, factories scale back, layoffs increase, domestic demand weakens even further. Here's what makes this truly terrifying. Everything is connected, everything reinforces everything else. Weak domestic demand pushes Chinese firms to overproduce and seek sales abroad, but overproduction leads to dumping goods overseas at ultra-low prices. That triggers global backlash, tariffs, bans, trade restrictions, which curtails China's export income, worsening the economic slowdown. Lower exports mean factory layoffs and falling wages, which further damps domestic consumption, and that weaker demand loops back, causing firms to lower prices even more and rely even harder on exports, which invites more backlash. It's a feedback loop from hell. And China's policy tools, the ones that worked so well in past crises, are now useless. Cutting interest rates doesn't stimulate borrowing when businesses see no profitable opportunities. Fiscal stimulus is now constrained by local governments drowning in debt and infrastructure projects that yield diminishing returns. Currency devaluation could make exports cheaper, but it risks capital flight that would be viewed as an aggressive move by trading partners. The classic levers Beijing used to pull, either unavailable or impotent. Meanwhile, time is running out. Every month, more mortgages sour, more graduates enter a job market with no openings, more factories sit idle, more families watch their life savings vanish into property investments that will never be completed. Youth unemployment has reached levels Beijing no longer wants to publish. They stopped reporting the numbers for some time because the figures had become too embarrassing. Small protests have started popping up, disgruntled homebuyers demanding refunds for undelivered apartments, laid off workers from state firms protesting unpaid benefits, even sporadic bank runs when rural lenders were rumored to be insolvent. The Communist Party has long derived its legitimacy from one promise: delivering prosperity and stability. What happens when it can no longer guarantee rising incomes, affordable housing, and secure employment? The central government knows these dangers. It responds with a mix of crackdowns and concessions. Dissent is quashed quickly. Censorship of economic bad news is tighter than ever. Financial whistleblowers are silenced. At the same time, Beijing offers mild stimulus, small cash handouts in some cities, subsidies for electric car buyers, support for startups. But these feel like band-aids on a gaping wound. The structural issues tower overhead: colossal debt, aging demographics, a government's model that stifle the private innovation needed for the next stage of development, and a more hostile international arena. Every element feeds into the others: geopolitical tension, economic stagnation, industrial overcapacity, financial stress. They're not isolating problems China can solve one by one, they're an interconnected web. This is perhaps the most alarming realization. Beijing faces not a series of challenges, but a systemic crisis. In the fall of the Soviet Union, military overstretch, economic malaise, and a loss of ideological confidence all reinforced each other in the 1980s, until the entire structure collapsed almost overnight. China in 2026 is vastly different. but it too is confronting a convergence of perils that test the resilience of its systems like never before. China's leaders still project confidence in public. They reassure that risks are under control, but the tone has unmistakably shifted from triumphalist to defensive. In September, Premier Li Xing emphasized stability above all, but the subtext is clear: the boom is over. The priority now is preventing a bust from tearing society apart. President Xi Jinping and the party elite show no inclinations to liberalize as a solution. Their instinct is to tighten political control and double down on nationalist rhetoric. They speak of self-reliance and the reliance of China's socialist system. Admitting the need for fundamental change would be an ideological inconvenience, a personal repudiation of Xi's decade of centralized rule. So the likely course is controlled retreat. Patch financial leaks to avoid banking crises, stimulate here and there to stave off outright recession, blame external forces like the US for economic troubles to divert public anger, and quietly inch toward restructuring, allowing some zombie firms to fail while managing the fallout, encourage mergers in bloated industries. Will it be enough? Increasingly, voices within China's own technocratic circles suggest the old toolkit won't save the future. Some compare the current trajectory to Japan in the 1990s, a long grinding stagnation. Others fear something worse, a financial crack-up or severe recession that shakes the regime's stability. What's certain is the margin for error has never been smaller. One wrong move, a mishandled bank failure, popular backlash to unemployment, a foreign policy misstep triggering sanctions could ignite a crisis the party struggles to contain. China stands at a fateful juncture. A great nation that once seemed destined to overtake all rivals is now hemorrhaging momentum. A confession of strategic fear revealed cracks in its geopolitical armor. A cascade of economic disasters, deflation, overcapacity, a property meltdown, exposed rot in its development model. External pressures tighten the vice, and the feedback loops of decline turn faster. History teaches that great powers often falter from within before they're defeated from without. The mighty Qing dynasty was brought low not merely by foreign guns but by internal rebellions and fiscal bankruptcy. The Soviet Union crumbled when its people lost faith in a stagnant system. If China cannot rejuvenate its model and restore confidence, both at home and abroad, it too may face a similar fate, a slow unraveling of the miracle, culminating in a transformative crisis. For now, the world is watching. The implications are enormous for the global economy, for power balances, for the millions of Chinese whose lives were transformed over the past 40 years. The party will do everything to postpone the reckoning, yet the image of spreading cracks is impossible to dispel. As one Chinese proverb goes, a dying camel is still bigger than a horse. Even in decline, a great entity remains formidable. China's collapse, if it comes, won't be simple. It'll be a complex epochal with aftershocks felt around the world. The secret fear admitted in Brussels may mark the beginning of that process. The moment China itself recognized that the forces bearing down on it could no longer be contained by business as usual. A storm has gathered over the Middle Kingdom, and its outcome may define the course of the 21st century. So, what do you think? Is this the beginning of China's long decline, or can Beijing pull off another miracle? Let us know in the comments, and if you want to stay ahead of the biggest shifts in global power, hit the subscribe button because the story is far from over.